Merhaba arkadaşlar. Hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Günlerdir gerçekten bunun için büyük bir şey var. Çaba sarf ediliyor. İyi ve sorunsuz geçmesi için. Umarım gerçekten güzel bir söyleşi olur, çalışma olur. Bir önceki Kolombiya e, deneyimleri gerçekten güzel geçmişti. Umarız bu da öyle geçer. Tekrar hepiniz hoş geldiniz.
Yavaştan başlayalım artık isterseniz. Gelen
35
arkadaşlar
oldu.
oluyor. Onlar geldikçe ekleriz yeniden.
Olur Perişan, sen bence giriş yap artık.
Merhabalar tekrardan. Hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Toplantı kayıt alınıyor, kayıt altına alınıyor bu arada. Önceden bilgisini verelim bütün arkadaşlara. Genelde kayıtları daha sonradan Atasoyer Sağlık Politika Okulu'nun sayfasına koyuyoruz. Oradan tekrar izleyebilirsiniz ama önceden bilgisini vermiş olayım. Bugün Barış ve Sağlık buluşmalarının ikincisini gerçekleştirmek üzere bir araya geldik. Grubu takip eden arkadaşların hatırlayacağı gibi geçtiğimiz Nisan ayında Atasoyer Sağlık Politika olarak bir uluslararası konferans düzenlemiştik. Konferansa Kolombiya, Güney Afrika, Arjantin, Guatemala, Küba ve İtalya'dan arkadaşlarla sağlık alanındaki mücadeleleri, kapitalist sistem dışı sağlık pratiklerine ve bunların olanaklarını tartışmıştık daha çok. Kasım ayında da yine Sayın Emanuel Rosenthal'le sağlık ve barış buluşmalarının ilkini gerçekleştirdik. Rosenthal bize Kolombiya'daki barış sürecini anlattı. Onu dinleme imkanımız oldu. Bugün ise yine konferans grubundan Sayın Devan Pillay bizimle birlikte. Öncelikle hoş geldin diyorum kendisine. Atasoyer Sağlık Politika Okulu adına. Hepimizin bildiği üzere aslında bugünlerde Kürdistan'ın Türkiye parçasında yaklaşık 45 yıldır süren çatışmalı sürecin sonlanması için bir görüşme, bir geçiş süreci yaşıyoruz. Böylesi zamanlarda, böylesi tarihsel eşiklerde aslında tam olarak birebir olmasa bile çatışma ve barış süreçlerinin benzerini yaşamış, bu süreçlerden geçmiş ülkelerin deneyimleri, gözlemleri ya da yorumları bizim için çok kıymetli. Bu yüzden de bugün hep birlikte Güney Afrika deneyimini konuşacağız. Dediğim gibi konuğumuz Devan Pillay, kendisi Witwatersrand Üniversitesi'nde sosyolog. Çalışmaları daha çok emek hareketleri, sendikal mücadele, toplumsal eşitsizlik, demokrasi, ekolojik adalet ve kapitalist dönüşüm üzerine yoğunlaşıyor. Devan apartheid dönemde siyasi bir tutukluk da yaşamış. Aynı zamanda sendikal yapılarda bulunmuş ve sonrasında da kamu görevi yürütmüş bir arkadaşımız. Bu yüzden de süreci sadece bir akademisyen gözüyle değil ama aynı zamanda o dönemin mücadelesini sürdürmüş bir birey olarak da kendisinden dinlemiş olacağız. Kısa bir teknik bilgilendirme yapayım. Toplantımız yaklaşık 90 dakika sürecek. İlk 40 dakikasında Devan'ı dinleyeceğiz. Sonrasında 10 dakikalık bir aramız olacak. Aradan sonra sorularımız, yorumlarımız sözlü ya da yazılı olarak iletebiliriz. Bitirdikten sonra da bir sonraki toplantıda buluşmak üzere devam edeceğiz. Daha fazla uzatmadan sözü Devan'a bırakıyorum. Sayın Devan Pillay, hoş geldiniz. Buyurun, söz sizde.
Thank you very much, and greetings to all of you. Very pleased to participate in this very worthwhile initiative. So I will be talking about what I call the transition to democracy in South Africa. That's how we frame these issues, but it's also about the peace process in a sense. And in order to get into that, I think it might be necessary to briefly try and sketch the historical background of what the struggle against apartheid was all about. Now, so what was the nature of this this liberation struggle that was being fought since the first colonization in 1652, European colonization in the southern part of Africa. The struggle has taken on various forms, and it coincides with the development of the economy in a particular fashion, the development of capitalism, basically. So we started off with the European expansion, the colonial expansion for raw materials and cheap labor and new markets. And the southern tip of Africa was one clear point of attraction. And agricultural capitalism began with the displacement
Geçen
of
istersen bir
indigenous
durdur.
people
Bence bir komut verelim. Herkes İngilizceden
and the
Türkçe'ye çevirip
enslavement of
sorun
people
yaşamış.
in certain parts of the country, especially in the Western Cape. And then the discovery of gold and diamond. Yes.
Devan, çok özür dilerim. Bir açıklama yapmam gerek. Çeviriye ulaşamayan arkadaşlar olmuş. Ekranın en alt kısmında ya 3 nokta şeklinde ya da dünya haritası şeklinde bir işaret olacak. Orayı tıkladığınızda çeviri seçenekleri çıkıyor. Türkçe ya da İngilizce diye. Türkçe çeviri dinlemek isteyen arkadaşlar o Türkçe kısmına basarsa kanalda kalacaklar ve konuşmanın Türkçe metnini duymuş olacaklar. Bir deneyin, eğer yapamazsınız tekrar konuşalım chat kısmından. Bölmek istemiyorum toplantıyı. Devin, buyur devam et. Bir sorun olursa tekrar arkadaşlarla birebir konuşuruz olması. Kusura bakmayın.
Okay. Okay, no, that's fine. So I was talking about the development of, the impact of colonialism and the development of capitalism in South Africa. And it marked a big turning point was when gold and diamonds were discovered in the later part of the 19th century. And that led to a massive influx of renewed colonization, of European colonization from Western Europe in particular, and the British and the Dutch were key parts of that, alongside others. Now, mining capitalism became the foundation of the development of capitalism in South Africa, but it also led to the offshoot of industrial capitalism, related industries to mining, and then in the Johannesburg area where I live now, a concentrated development, urbanization, and industrial capitalism. And along with that, of course, we had the emergence of working class organization alongside the development of capitalism in the urban areas, in the manufacturing sector, but also in the mining sector. So you had strong mine workers unions emerging and manufacturing unions. And that working class movement existed in parallel with the development of the African nationalist movement. And the two were competing and combining in what became known as the dialectic of race and class in South Africa. White supremacy became entrenched as an official policy in different forms, in different waves. and that was the racial dimension, the racial oppression. And capitalist exploitation became the class question, and the working class posed that class question. And of course, you had, alongside this, a patriarchy, which is also a universal issue, and which raised the gender question. Now, during the struggle against apartheid, gender was marginalized as a secondary issue. So race and class were at the forefront of debates and struggle throughout the past century. And so you had mass mobilizations in rural and urban areas, culminating in the banning of the key organizations in the struggle, which was the African National Congress. And prior to that, the South African Communist Party was also banned and driven underground. So after a period of mass mobilization up until 1960, these organizations, alongside others, were pushed underground. So that's when the armed struggle began against apartheid capitalism, as some people call it, or racial capitalism. And that that underground struggle took different forms. There was an armed struggle, so and Nelson Mandela led the initiative to travel around the world to generate support for an armed struggle, which was not particularly successful. It was more of a symbolic armed struggle, although it had its moments of high drama. But also you had, as part of that underground exile movement, you had a growing campaign of isolation of the apartheid regime. So boycott campaigns of various kinds, sports boycotts was very, very prominent. And then eventually economic sanctions, which took a while to come into effect. So by the 1980s, economic sanctions started to take off. But the sports boycotts had quite a major symbolic impact on white South Africans, because they next to religion, they found sport of great spiritual value for them. So it was a big hit for them to be isolated. And of course, this parallels to what is happening in Palestine today and the attempts to isolate Israel. They're trying to use those similar tactics and it's slowly building up, but it's still not as effective. Now, so what happened was, so you had this underground struggle and the struggle from exile building up. Took a long time to build up, and by the late 1970s, it started to gather force. But that was directly related to the rebuilding of an internal mass mobilization inside the country, initially led by a renewed mobilization of the working class, the trade union movement from the early 1970s. The massive strike wave, and that was the beginning of the formation of new trade unions that were not affiliated to any of the current political groups. They were not hostile to them, but they were independent. They said, we want to build trade unions and the working class movement that is independent of political organizations, even though they could cooperate with them. And then you also had, in the 1970s, a massive uprising of students. So the 1973 was the working class strike wave. In 1976 was the student uprising. And the students were there were different sets of political actors involved, right? And so the Black consciousness movement played a big role in the student uprisings. But what the Communist Party and the African National Congress, the ANC, did was they managed to out-organize and capture the militancy of the students in exile and recruited them into the underground movement, partially as well, both inside and outside the country. So you had predominantly two parallel streams of struggle. The one led by the Communist Party and the African National Congress, and the National Liberation Struggle under the banner of the National Liberation Struggle. And then you had the working class movement, in an independent movement led by the trade unions in the 1980s. And that's when things really grew to a massive extent. And then you had minority groups, both from the Trotskyists, very small Trotskyist groups, and you had remnants of the Black consciousness movement, who also formed trade unions, but they were not as powerful as the trade unions, of the independent trade unions. And then the trade unions formed, legal trade unions formed by those who were aligned to the ANC and the Communist Party. And eventually they came together to form the Congress of South African Trade Unions in 1985. Now, this is very important to note because all of this feeds into the character of the peace process. So you had a very powerful, independent working class movement, and arguably they led the struggle against apartheid inside the country. And then you had an exile movement led by the African National Congress in alliance with the Communist Party in exile. And while these two streams came together within one big trade union federation, there were still these competing interests. And then alongside them, and there's a paper I can give you that sketches some of this, was the United Democratic Front, which I was, as a student, involved with before I was arrested. And they also led the mass movement inside the country, and they were independent but aligned to the ANC. When they were banned by the regime, the trade union movement took the lead in the anti-apartheid struggle inside the country. So while all that was happening, right, a massive mobilization within the country against the regime, sanctions, other forms of boycotts, isolation of the regime. And then the fall of the Soviet Union also played a role in opening up the space for a negotiations process. So I'm cutting a very long and complicated story very short. And so by the end of the 1980s, you had pressure to release Nelson Mandela from prison. That campaign was growing. And you had this mass movement inside the country. You had some armed struggle outside, but more symbolic than really very successful. But nonetheless, it played a role in generating the resistance mood. And then you had, in exile, leading figures of the African National Congress and Communist Party negotiating directly with the apartheid regime. And that brought about eventually the unbanning of the Communist Party, the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, which was a smaller grouping, in 1990. So that's when things changed quite dramatically inside the country. The apartheid regime had to make a choice. Do they continue with their very, very brutal campaign of military destabilization of neighboring countries, which were harboring the guerrilla movements, as well as the detention and also brutalization of people inside the country, where the mass movement, despite repression, were kept on re-emerging. And a key factor in this was white monopoly capital, right? The economy by the 1970s onwards had become highly monopolized, and white monopoly capital, both the Afrikaner sections and the English sections, had come together to form a very powerful monopolized form of capitalism. And they understood that the unrest inside the country was destabilizing the conditions for accumulation. And along with international forces, countries in the West and elsewhere, and other bodies, they decided that there needed to be momentum towards a political settlement. Now, for white monopoly capital, so on the one hand, you had the working class movement and the Communist Party and the ANC all talking about a socialist form of struggle and a socialist outcome. But during the negotiations process, they came to an accommodation around preserving the essential character of the capitalist economy and the monopoly character of the capitalist economy, with some important key adjustments. So in return for a political settlement, the white monopoly capital negotiated their entrenchment within the economy, but they allowed themselves to be split up to some extent, and under the policy of Black economic empowerment. So politically connected Black elites got stakes in the economy, and that became a key part of the settlement. So the settlement, the actual peace negotiations process, you could say, in earnest, in the open, took about 4 to 5 years. It culminated in what was called the Congress of a Democratic South Africa, which was a huge multi-party forum to negotiate a new constitution and the basic principles of the new South Africa. And they did come up with a very democratic constitution, regarded as one of the most democratic in the world. It entrenched certain labor rights, so that was the compromise with labor. So labor was a powerful voice and force. So labor was given not all it wanted, but a fairly high-class labor dispensation with labor rights entrenched, a Bill of Rights, it entrenched democratic freedoms, and a range of other rights enshrined in the Constitution. But of course, a lot of these rights entrenched in the Constitution, liberal democratic rights, were contradicted by the inability to transform those rights into real material gains for all the people. So you have a situation where a significant section of the population have benefited from this new dispensation, and a Black middle class has grown, but the economy is still predominantly owned by white monopoly capital, predominantly, and agriculture is still predominantly white-owned. And so those are still seeds of discontent in the context of high rising inequality, which is a worldwide phenomenon, because of the neoliberal nature of capitalism, in South Africa as elsewhere, and very high unemployment, or in the formal economy, although there is debate about how you measure employment in the informal economy, which has grown rapidly since the first democratic elections in 1994, and widespread poverty around the country. All those persist and are seeds of discontent inside the country. So you have a situation where the white Afrikaners who held political power gave up that power to a large extent, but the key players, the key actors within the white Afrikaner sector, the capitalist the capitalist class fractions were more allied with the capitalist class fractions within the English-speaking sector of the white population. And their interests were secured in the new dispensation. But they have lost political power, except in the Western Cape, which is one part of the country where they control that province, which is where you probably, I don't know if you all know of the city Cape Town. Cape Town is a very attractive part of the country. Now, of course, the end result of all of this is that the African National Congress, they won the first election and they continued to win elections with huge majorities afterwards, such that apart from the Western Cape province, for most of this period, it has been called a one-party dominant democracy. So this okay, if you want me to talk more about the peace process period, I can come back to that. So I need to just finish, I'll sketch the whole story and you can come back to those parts you want me to elaborate on further. I know that I'm skipping a lot of things. But so you have this, I'm giving you the political dynamic in the country. So you have the situation where the African National Congress, in alliance with the South African Communist Party and the Congress of South African Trade Unions, what is called the Triple Alliance. They have run the country since 1994 predominantly at the political level. But they have not run the economy in the way that they would have wanted. And the trade union federation that is in alliance with the ruling party, it's a very tension-ridden alliance, such that by 2014, there was a major split in the trade union federation, and forming another federation, the South African Federation of Trade Unions, saying that we don't want to be part of this ruling alliance. It's not serving working class interests. So that was one big split. And there were other two political parties that were formed as well, further splits. Not to the left, because I regard those as racial populists, the Economic Freedom Fighters, and the MK Party, which is named after the guerrilla army. But the leader of that party, he was the former president who presided over the biggest corruption period in the country from 2009 until he was kicked out in 2018. That's when corruption went completely out of hand, and we are still trying to repair the country. So we're facing the problem in the post-apartheid era of a degree of political stability, because it's a democratic country, but a lot of fraying at the edges because of high inequality and poverty and unemployment. The rise of populist right-wing parties posing as left-wing parties within the black community, as well as the rise, the reassertion in recent times of white Afrikaner nationalism. And they've gone directly to Donald Trump. I don't know if you heard this story. And they're saying there's a white genocide in South Africa, and Donald Trump is now putting pressure on the South African government. I don't know if you heard all the debacle about the G20 next year in the USA and how they excluded South Africa. So there's a reassertion of right-wing nationalism both amongst the black population and amongst the white population. And in the center, we have a government of national unity because for the first time, the African National Congress lost its majority in the last election last year. And now you have a government of national unity with the African National Congress still dominant, is ruling in alliance, in coalition with the Democratic Alliance. Which is a predominantly white party and that rules the Western Cape province and a few other smaller parties. But the end result of that alliance, even though it hasn't altered the economic trajectory in any meaningful way, it has brought about a degree of stability, and the economy now is picking up and the currency is getting strong, etc. So we are in this very unstable equilibrium, let's say, at the moment. So you could say what is called the peace process. In fact, if one thinks about it, you cannot confine it only to that period of 1990 to 1994. You can say it's still continuing because there are many issues that are unresolved in the country. The class question, the question of land ownership, the question of inequality, the redistribution of wealth, the white domination of the economy. So the racial dynamics are there. What has happened, the one big change, although it's not necessarily as fundamental as one would like, is that the question of patriarchy and gender has become much more prominent in the democratic struggle, the transition. So, in other words, we are still in the democratic transition in key fundamental ways, even though we have settled on one aspect, one outcome, which is the democratic constitution, which in its fundamental senses is not being questioned. Certain aspects are being questioned, but its fundamentals are not yet being questioned, although there are threats coming from our former president, who has sent young people to Russia to be trained for what? We still want to know exactly, except that the Russians fooled them and they are training them to fight the Ukrainians. And he's gone to visit the new military leader of Burkina Faso, Traore. You may have heard of him. He poses himself as an anti-imperialist fighter, but he is a dictator. So there are those signs that the former president, the disgraced one, the corrupt one, is trying, and he's using his children, his daughters and his son, to try to generate a new political leadership. So there are all these uncertainties in the country that we face at the moment. So our peace process has been predominantly peaceful, but not completely peaceful. And there's a degree of instability inherent in this process and a degree of uncertainty that we face. But let me stop there because I'd rather get your questions so I can focus on those aspects that you are most interested in getting further elaboration on.
Teşekkür ederim çok. Yaklaşık bir 35 dakikamız oldu. Soruları ikinci bölümde almayı planlıyoruz. Sen de biraz yoruldun sanırım. İstersen bir 10 dakika bir ara verelim. O sırada arkadaşlar sorularını hem sözlü olarak dile getirebilirler hem chat bölümüne yazabilirler. Hangisini tercih ederlerse ona göre ikinci bölüme devam ederiz. Yani eğer bu bölümde ekleyeceğim bir şey yoksa
Okay.
kısa bir ara vereceğiz, bir 10 dakikalık.
Soruları sohbete alalım değil mi? Yani şu anda alabiliriz yani.
Evet, evet, soruları arkadaşlar konuşma boyunca da alabilirler de arada da alabilirler. Eklendikçe biz onu paylaşırız, okuruz. Söz almak isteyen arkadaş olursa da yani çok fazla yoruma girmeden kısaca sadece soru şeklinde ilerleyebilirsek iyi olur. Bir oturumumuz daha olacak. Şimdilik bir 10 dakika ara verelim arkadaşlar. 10 dakika sonra görüşürüz. Çıkmanıza gerek yok. Yani kameraları ve sesi kapatmanız yeterli. 10 dakika sonra görüşürüz. Merhabalar tekrardan. Herkes geldiyse devam edebiliriz toplantıya. Devan burada. Çevirmen arkadaşlar burada. Tamamdır. Toplantımızın ikinci bölümüne geçebiliriz arkadaşlar. İlk bölümde Devan bize 90'lı yıllardaki apartheid rejimin yıkılmasından sonra Güney Afrika'daki demokrasiye geçiş sürecini anlattı. Barış'ın aslında 4-5 yıllık bir süreçten ibaret olmadığını, aslında mücadelenin ve demokratikleşme derdinin halen sürdüğünden bahsetti. Kürtler de aslında yaşadıkları coğrafyada egemen devletlerin kimlik dayatmasına, şiddetine, sömürüsüne karşı 100 yıl aşkın süredir 4 farklı parçada kimi dönem silahlı, kimi dönem silahsız, başarılı ya da başarısız mücadeleler yürütüyorlar. Çeşitli müzakere süreçlerine dahil oluyorlar. Geçtiğimiz ay aslında Manuel de benzer bir yere değinmişti. Yani savaşmıyor olmak her şeyin çözüldüğü ya da çözülebileceği anlamına gelmiyor. Sadece çözüme bir olanak tanıyor, bir kapı aralıyor. İşin sonrasında nereye gideceği tamamen bu süreçte vereceğimiz mücadeleye bağlı aslında. Bu bölümde arkadaşların yorumlarını ve sorularını alacağız. Eğer sözlü söz almak isteyen arkadaş varsa eli kaldırabilir, kendisine söz vereceğiz ya da yazılı olarak sorusunu iletmek isteyen varsa yine soruyu Devon'la paylaşacağız. Buyurun arkadaşlar, söz salonda.
İki yazılı şey var. Perişan, istersen oradan başlayabiliriz.
Nereye yazılmış hocam?
Sohbette yok mu? Biri silinmiş galiba da.
Tamam. Mizgin'in sorusu var. Ahmet'ten. Sayın Devan Pillay, spor büyük bir etki yaratıyor diye ifade etti. Kürdistan coğrafyasındaki Ahmet Spor, Van Spor ve Mardin Spor takımlarımız sürece nasıl katkı sunmalılar? Nasıl bir tutum sergilemeliler? Barış müzakerelerinde anayasal bir hak olarak spor nasıl ele alınmalı? Kendileri bu konudaki fikirlerini bizimle paylaşmasını rica ediyoruz. Bu arada Devan'ı Ahmet Spor maçına davet ediyoruz demiş arkadaşımız.
Bir soru daha var. Muzaffer Çelik Sözlü'nün. Bu soru belki buradan başlasak rahat edebiliriz. İlk kısmı da özetleyebilir. Şöyle söylemiş Muzaffer Çelik Söz. Bugünden geriye bakarak değerlendirdiğimizde barışın olumlu sonuçlarını sıralayabilir miyiz? Ne kazanıldı barış sürecinden Güney Afrika'da diye bir özet geçebilir mi diye bir soru sormuş.
Nurşat'ın sorusu var yine. Türkiye'deki süreci başlangıç olarak nasıl görüyor? Yani sürecin henüz çok başındayız. Bu haliyle süreci nasıl görüyor, nasıl değerlendiriyor diye bir sorusu var arkadaşımızın.
Bence bunlarla başlayalım mı arkadaşlar?
Tamam.
Zaman içerisinde yazacaktır.
Devin, soruları bu haliyle cevaplamak ister misin? Başlayalım istersen bir yerden.
Yes.
Buyur.
Okay. If I understood correctly about sport, about the role sport has played Well, in the South African context, as I said, it was symbolically very, very important, the sports boycott. But messaging through sport can be very, very powerful, because that is where a lot of young people are, and people who are not necessarily politically aware of all the issues in society. So it has that very powerful potential impact. And both in terms of messaging in stadiums, as well as international isolation of sports teams, which, as I said, is something that has not really begun in earnest with Israel, but it is slowly beginning to emerge, both in terms of broadly, not just sports, cultural boycotts, cultural pressure can be a very powerful form of pressure. So what are the positive aspects of the South African peace process? I think yes, one can talk about many positive aspects, even while we are aware of all the potential pitfalls. The major positive outcome was the manner in which the political organizations and the skillful manner in which the leaders of both the trade union movement, and our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was a key trade union leader in the 1980s in the Mine Workers Union. And then he became a billionaire. So for him, it's been a very positive outcome. And he was a key proponent of the Black economic empowerment policy. So let's say there are different degrees of positivity, or different levels of positive outcomes. So there are those who have benefited enormously, and that is the new economic elite that have become millionaires or billionaires in this process. But it would not be accurate to say that they are the only ones who have benefited. There's a very, very large middle class who have benefited from these both affirmative action policies and also Black economic empowerment. Those are two different sets of policies. Affirmative action is related to employment in the workplace and in the universities, etc. And that has been a very important tool to de-racialize the workforce, especially at the management or university at the professional levels, let's say. And so for that class of people, it has been a very positive outcome. If you just look at buying power trends, it has shifted dramatically from the 1980s, where if you look at marketers, for example, and they do market surveys, and they know who the consumers are, and they would target the white middle class population up until the 1980s. Now it's increasingly a Black middle class population that they are targeting, which shows that the buying power, the consumer power of a major section of the Black population has benefited from this democratic transition. They're not the majority, but they're a significant section of the population. And in a sense, you could say they also provide the stability in society. And you have a de-racialization as well as the empowerment of women in all sectors of society. So that's a major positive aspect. So the universities, women have been included in affirmative action. So they were the first major beneficiaries of affirmative action. So if you look at the universities, women have risen to very prominent positions, and black women as well, but also white women. White women are also regarded as beneficiaries of affirmative action. So women of all sectors of the population have benefited. And you'll find that both in the public sector and in the private sector. So the deracialization of the workforce at all levels of the economy, and in the boardrooms to some extent. And then somehow in relation to that, the labor laws, as I said earlier, were very progressive, and the protection of the working class, of the workforce, or all those in employment, not just those, depends on how you define the working class, but all those who are employed, there's a high degree of protection. So you can't just be fired easily. You have to go through a process. And that was a hard-fought gain by the labor movement. A whole range of other social policies have been implemented, which are quite progressive. The very limited welfare provisions during the apartheid era. So you had a racialized welfare system where the white population received generous pensions and other forms of welfare. After 1994, that was deracialized, and so it came down in value from the high amounts of the white population to a more average amount to the rest. So now it's at not a very high amount, but unlike most countries in Africa and in the developing world, you could say, we still have a pension system that is available for everyone. You have a child care grant available to everyone, but at a low level, and a disability grant. So you can access these welfare provisions. So it's a neoliberal macroeconomy in one sense, but it's also there are elements of the welfare state that has been spread to all the population. Unemployment benefits are also available, etc. So that could partly explain why, in a country of such high unemployment or such low formal employment, let's say, but as I said, a very large a growing informal economy, and high levels of recorded poverty, but there hasn't been generalized instability in the country. And you could argue these welfare payments to people contributes to that relative stability, even though it frays at the edges at times when you have protests and uprisings here and there. So those are the protection of democratic freedoms, or the institution of democratic freedoms is quite deep. It was fought for during the 1980s and the gradual opening up even during the apartheid era. And then, of course, its entrenchment after 1994. That's something that we cannot take for granted. The media freedom, academic freedom, it's very, very pronounced, which is under threat in other parts of the world. Sorry, I'm not sure why this suddenly came on. Oh. And a whole range of other democratic freedoms are deeply entrenched. So we complain a lot as a society, but we have the ability to complain, you could say. which is a freedom that is being contracted in the USA and to some extent even in the UK. Whereas in South Africa, the freedom to protest is deeply entrenched. But not without, of course, its negative, the negative aspects as well, and corruption and maladministration are what cuts against that. So, we have, in the past, we had electricity shortages because of the incompetent manner in which they ran our electricity energy companies, and water shortages in this city because of the incompetent manner in which they messed up the water systems, etc. So yes, but the positives are definitely there. In terms of what I know about the Turkish peace process, unfortunately, I don't know as much as I would like, but from what I can gather, I found it very interesting that there was a decision to give up the armed struggle, which seemed to be giving it up quite easily. In the South African context, there was a formal commitment to give up the armed struggle, even though it wasn't a very successful armed struggle, it was nonetheless there, without laying down the arms until there was an agreed peace deal. The impression I get from the Turkish context is that you've already given up the arms, but the peace deal is not finally determined. But I may be wrong, I may be misreading that. But that seems to be from the outside what you have. And that's of course in the Turkish situation. What I'm monitoring a bit more is what's happening in Rojava and northern Syria. But that's of course a much more complex situation. But anything that would get the Turkish armed forces and destabilization off the backs of the people of Rojava can only be welcomed, because they need that breathing space to negotiate autonomy within the context of the Syrian state. But as I say, I don't know deeply enough, except that if this results in the release of Öcalan, who can then play a role similar to what Mandela played openly inside the country, that can only be a positive outcome that can lead to a peaceful process in Turkey. But I am mindful, I think some people have said that you don't fully trust Erdogan, which is of course a healthy position to take. But whatever can be realized has to be supported. But you cannot, I'm presuming that mass mobilization and organization within the country is not separated from these negotiations. And if that's the case, then it has more chances of a better outcome. So that's all I can say at the moment on that.
Devan, birkaç soru daha var ileteceğim. Muzaffer Çelik söz sormuş. Kaç dil resmi olarak kabul edilmiştir? Barış'tan sonra dil konusunda değişim oldu mu diye sormuş. Yine bir arkadaşımızın sorusu var. Kadınların kazanımlarından bahsetti aslında Devan, ama Aycan bu süreçteki kadın hareketinin katkısından, yürütücülüğünden bahsetmenizi istemiş. Yani kazanımlardan değil, sürecin kendisinde kadınlar nasıl bir rol oynadı, nasıl bir öncülük ettiler diye bir sorusu var. Benim de bir sorum olacak aslında. Güney Afrika'daki Uzlaşı ve Hakikat Komisyonu ile ilgili. Yani bizde de geçmiş görüşme süreçlerinde de Kürt hareketi hep benzer bir vurgusu oldu. hakikatlerin ortaya çıkması, kayıpların tanınması meselesi ısrarla vurgulandı. Yani bu yaşadığımız çatışma döneminde hem Kürt halkının yaşadığı büyük acılar, kayıplar, travmalar var. Aynı şekilde Türk tarafı açısından da özellikle sivil ölümler meselesi hala kapalı bir kutu. Şunu sormak istiyorum. Güney Afrika'daki Uzlaşma ve Hakikat Komisyonu toplumda gerçekten bir adalet duygusu sağladı mı, yoksa sadece bir işte hikayeyi anlatma, kayda geçme, resmi olarak bir kayıt işlemi miydi? O dönemi hem yaşamış hem bedel ödemiş biri olarak bu yüzleşme, ceza, af meselesini nasıl değerlendiriyorsunuz?
Bir soru daha var Pelin.
Ee, Göremiyorum. Hangi bölümde karar?
Sorry, I'm not hearing any translation.
Ben okuyayım Ruşen'in sorusu var değil mi? Ruşen'in
Beğenirim, ben
sorusu.
göremiyorum.
Ben okuyayım o zaman. Eşitlikçi bir anayasanın oluşturulduğundan bahsettiniz. Türkiye'de terörle mücadele kanunu var ve bu yasa kapsamında aslında binlerce muhalif ifade özgürlüğünü ve örgütlenme hakkını kullandığı için yargılanıyor ve ağır hapis cezalarına maruz kalıyor. Sizin deneyimlerinizde anayasa düzenleme öncesi böyle bir kanun var mıydı? Yani apartheid'da terörle mücadele kanunu var mıydı diye bir soru var. Varsa anayasal düzenlemeler sonrası bu yasa uygulaması ne oldu diye sormuş Ruşen arkadaşımız.
Okay, should I answer that? Well, there were three questions, so that's a bit to answer. Well, I'm officially a terrorist because I was arrested under our terrorism laws. So under apartheid, we definitely had those laws. Detention without trial became very notorious. You could be held in detention for weeks, months, sometimes even years. Although there was a legal process nonetheless, and there was pressure to ensure that those who are detained finally do get a trial. But there were some brutal deaths in detention and torture, especially in the late 1970s and 1980s. Torture in prisons became a very common thing. Some very prominent political leaders were killed in jail, in detention. I was tortured while in jail, so that was a common practice. But of course, there were different degrees of that. And assassinations of leaders happened during the anti-apartheid struggle. So we definitely had terrorism laws, but all of those were abolished under the new democratic constitution. Detention without trial and all those provisions have been abolished because it's a completely new constitution, democratic constitution. So rights and freedoms are very much embedded in the Bill of Rights. So arbitrary arrests, arbitrary detentions, you do have those happening. And when it does happen, it gets exposed, the media exposes it, and the police have to be held accountable. Of course, you do get brutality in the prison system today, but that will be more with common criminals more than political actors, although occasionally that happens. But it's not part of the law. So you will get those abuses by the police force. And if it's exposed, then they can be held accountable. So at least we have made strong measures against that. There are 11 official languages in the country, although English is the dominant language. And Afrikaans is still one of the official languages. And we also have Braille, the language for, not Braille, for the sign language for deaf and dumb people. That's also considered a 12th language. But the language discussion is an ongoing discussion. Official documents are now all in English, but you also add other African languages to official documents. But the universal language is English, so that's a common language in all the provinces. But some provinces have different. Each province has a language that is dominant, apart from English, and there's always discussion as to how to make these more marginalized languages more prominent in schools and in textbooks, etc. So textbooks are predominantly in English. All universities are now taught in English. So even the former Afrikaans universities, they still have Afrikaans language classes, but English is taken over as the common language there as well. But it's an ongoing conversation as to how to make the indigenous African languages more widespread, and not only English. Now, the thing is, it's an interesting, complex discussion. Maybe in the rural areas, you might have more campaigning around languages. In the urban areas, the parents, in many instances, encourage their children to learn English because they say, well, that's the language of business. That's the language of, the workplace. So if you want to get a good job, pay more attention to English. So you get all those sorts of different takes on this. Women's empowerment was stressed increasingly during the 1980s. So it was always there during the liberation struggle, the question of patriarchy and women's empowerment, but it was subordinated. During the 1980s, women's groups grew, and I mentioned the United Democratic Front, and they had very strong women's sections, women's affiliates. It was the front of different organizations. And they increasingly made their voices heard. A feminist movement in the universities, it became very prominent within the student movement, but then it spread more generally. So by the time in 1990, when we had the opening up of the political process, women increasingly played a prominent role in various sectors of society and of the negotiations process. Still predominantly male-led, but women played an increasingly important role in that, which is why gender empowerment became a prominent part of the new dispensation and the new constitution, protecting gender rights and gender empowerment. And as I say, it's embedded in affirmative action policies, gender, not only race. Yeah, I think I hope I've answered those questions satisfactorily.
Teşekkür ederim Devan. Söz almak isteyen arkadaşımız var, Mehmet Zencir. Mehmet Hocam, buyurun, söz sizde.
Ben şeyi merak ettim. Yani 94'lere kadar tüm süreci anlatırken Komünist Parti'den tutarım işçi sınıfının, sendikalarının çok güçlü bir direnişleri olduğunu görüyoruz. Aslında biraz devrimci bir antikapitalist, kapitalizm aşan bir mücadele ön plandayken 94 sonrası bu mücadelenin akıbeti ne oldu? Yani bir güncel dersek, mesela güncelde Güney Afrika görebildiğimiz kadar kapitalizmin en sert geçtiği ülkelerden bir tanesi. Burada yeni bir devrimci bir potansiyelin durumu nedir? Apartheid'in aşılması bu sürece katkı mı koydu, yoksa farklı bir zemine mi evirdi? Onu öğrenmek isterim.
Teşekkür ederiz Mehmet Hoca. Başka
Yes,
sorusu olan arkadaş yoksa sözü yine Devan'a vereceğim.
yes. Okay, the one paper I can send you discusses this a bit more. So, now, first of all, the role of the Communist Party, I think I've hinted at this. There's been many, I think in the Kurdish struggle, you've also had a reconsideration of the Marxist, Leninist, and perhaps Stalinist characterization of the working class struggle. And the South African Communist Party was very much from that tradition, right? Very much supportive of the Soviet Union, uncritical of the Soviet Union. And it brought that into the nature of its alliance with the African National Congress, where critics say it subordinated itself to the nationalist struggle. Now, the trade union movement tried to forge an independent Marxism, or let's say the independent trade union movement were inspired by a humanist Marxism. And Rick Turner was one of the inspirations for that. He was a political science lecturer in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And he was one of the inspirations for the new trade union movement. It was independent of the Communist Party and had a more of a democratic Marxist, humanist Marxist approach. And those existed in parallel. But they came together in 1985 in the Congress of South African Trade Unions, but those differences still remained. Now, within the trade union movement. Now, the Communist Party did become more internally democratic after 1990, not so top-down, vanguardist, but it still bears that legacy to a large extent. Whereas you have an independent streams of working class thinking, including over the last 10 years or so, 10, 15 years, an eco-socialist strain of thinking. But the Communist Party is still perhaps the biggest political party that claims to represent the working class. And they are in close collaboration with COSATU, the biggest trade union federation. Now, what has happened is that there's increasing dissatisfaction within the Communist Party and in the labor movement about the manner in which it has subordinated itself to the African National Congress, right? So now what you have is a very interesting discussion happening because they took a resolution, the Communist Party took a resolution in December last year to fight the next local elections, which will be next year, separately. But the problem is they want to have, the expression, you want to have your cake and eat it. So they want to remain in the alliance, but they want to fight the elections separately. So they're having a big meeting of the African National Congress this week. With the Communist Party and the trade unions are always invited to these. And they are trying to plead their case. They say, no, we are with you, but we want to fight against you in the elections. So it's not a viable strategy. So it's a half-hearted, they are too afraid to break away to fight with a clear working class program because the patronage relationship with the ruling party is there because many Communist Party members are also ministers in the government. So it's a very incoherent policy. Similarly, within COSATU, the biggest trade union federation, they are used to being a ladder for the trade union leaders to go into government to get positions either at a lower level in the city councils or in the provincial level or right up to ministerial level. So that patronage relationship is quite strong. Whereas ordinary members are saying, no, we want to have an independent profile within the political system as a working class movement and arguing for clear-cut socialist policies. There are minority parties or formations that want to argue for independent class politics, but they're not very strong at the moment. And the rival trade union federation, which is led by the former general secretary of COSATU, and they're called the South African Federation of Trade Unions, they haven't grown as fast as it was thought they would grow. So it is still an uncertain terrain. We'll see next year how the Communist Party does in the local elections, but they need to decide what they want to be, either subordinated to the nationalist project or to forge an independent working class politics. So we are approaching a turning point, but we haven't quite reached a turning point in that sense yet.
Rengin arkadaşımız el kaldırmış. Rengin buyur, sesini açıp konuşabilirsin.
Merhabalar. Öncelikle hepinizin eline emeğine sağlık. Değerli katkılar için teşekkürler. Benim biraz uzun olacak ama ben biraz aslında üç soru sormak istiyorum ve bu 3 soruyu açan aslında neden oraya bağladığımı anlatan bir şekilde ilerleyecek. Şimdi birincisi bir de birazdan yani aslında hepsine azar azar değinildi ama ben biraz hem süreç Kürtler için nasıl ilerledi, yani işte bir kök neden, sürecin toplumsallaşması ve inançsızlık nedenleriyle ilgili sorular soracağım. Biraz onları açmak istiyorum. Şimdi öncelikle hem Devan'ın da biraz bu sürece dair bence boşluklarını biraz da anlatabilmek için. Şimdi yani 1800'lerde yani ıslahatla beraber bu batılılaşma işte biraz daha mesela biraz daha bizler için bu tarafa doğru yani işte vergiler verme, daha öncesinde bizim kendi beyliklerimiz vesairemiz vardı ama böyle bir şeye dönüştü. Daha sonra İkinci Dünya Savaşı'nda Kasr Şirin'le beraber jeopolitik bir kırılma oldu. 4 parçaya ayrıldı. Daha sonra Cumhuriyet'in kurulması, asimilasyon meselesi oldu. Biraz da heyecanlıyım hocam. Tamam, hemen şey yapıyorum. Tamam. Tamam, ben teşekkür ederim hocam. Kaldığım yerden mi devam edeyim yoksa başa şey yapayım mı? Kasr Şirin, peki. İkincisi, İkinci Dünya Savaşı'nda işte Kasr Şirin dediğim gibi orada Kürtler açısından işte jeopolitik bir kırılma oldu, 4 parça bölünme oldu. Üçüncüsü Cumhuriyet'in kurulması ve bir asimilasyon. Dördüncüsü Cumhuriyet sonrası eşsizlik politikaları, ekonomik boyutu ve saygınlık boyutuyla bir şeye gittik. Daha sonra beşincide Kürtler ve devlet arasında aşırı antidemokratik meselelerin olması, insan onuruna, haysiyetine dayalı bir mücadele devam ediyor olması. Daha sonra 2005'ten sonra bunların hepsi iç içe devam ederek bazen de biçim değiştirerek karşımıza çıktı. Bir diğeri 2009-2011'de yine bu Oslo görüşmeleriyle beraber başka bir şeye biraz daha evrilmeye başladı. Biraz da olsa baskı kalktı. Kürt halkı ilk defa uluslararası meşruluk kazandı ve işte uluslararası cana Kürt halkı ve devlet bir şekilde şeye başladı, masa başına oturmaya başladı. Sonrasında 2013-2015 süreçleri başladı ve yasal kısıtlamalar, yönelimler tekrar bize dönmeye başladı. Yani bu biraz daha o süreçlerin bozulmasına dönük şeyler oldu. Şimdi bunlar olurken evet bizler için örnek veriyorum PKK ya da Kürt hareketi için işte bölgesel meşru bir alan kazanıldı. Halk için işte bozulan her sürecin ağır bedellerin ödeniyor. Yani tamamen böyle söylemiyorum ama yani olumluları cebe koyarak söylüyorum bunu. Halk için biraz da ağır süreçlerin bedelleri ödenilmesine dönüldü. Bir de burada devam eden ya oradaki travmalar hala devam ediyor şeklinde ilerliyor. Yani bir türlü sürecin ikna olmamasına dönük mesela ilerlendi. Daha sonra biraz böyle sürecin toplumsallaşmasıyla ilgili biraz şöyle mesela bir yavaşlık yaşıyoruz süreç olarak. Bu defa öncekiler gibi kolay ikna olamıyoruz. Sürecin adımlarını desteklemek ve başarılı olacağına inanmakla ilgili bir kopukluk var. Yani evet biz destekliyoruz ama başarılı olacağına inançla ilgili mesela daha öncesinde bunlar bütünleşikti. Örnek veriyorum ya da daha güçlüydü, daha şeydi. Şimdi mesela böyle bir kopukluk mesela görebiliyoruz. Yani tabii ki burada şunun farkındayız. Bir toplumsal rıza inşa edilmesi gerektiğinin farkındayız. Ama edilmezse de işte uzun süreceği ya da işte belki de olmayacağı, bir sonraki adıma geçilmeyeceğinin de farkındayız. Yani o yüzden toplumsallaşma önemlidir diyoruz. Bir de hani biraz daha mesela temkinli.
Rengin
Çünkü
sesin kapandı ama rica da edeceğim. Biraz toparlayıp soruna gelme şansın var mı acaba?
evet, hemen
Yaklaşık
geliyorum.
5 dakikalık süremiz kaldı.
Hı hı. Geliyorum. Ya kusura bakmayın, şeydeyim, nöbetteyim de bazen böyle gitgeller olabiliyor. E, Neyse burada ben şuna da değinip soruma bağlayacağım. Şimdi bir de inançsızlıklarımız var. Mesela bu süreçle beraber gelişen hani devletin adım atmaması, kararlı olmaması, bunun hukuki boyutunun olmaması, biraz daha kapalı oluyor olması, açık olmuyor olması gibi e, mesela şeyler var. Daha önceki yaşanan bedellerin ağır olması gibi bir sürü böyle sayacağımız nedenler var. Şimdi bu minvalde tam yani süreç böyle ilerliyorken birincisi silahlı ve legal ve illegal alandaki bu şeyi nasıl yapıyorsun? Hani az önce konuşmanın sırasında şey dediniz. Silahı bırakıyor olması şaşırtıcıydı demiştiniz. Hani tüm bu şeyde. Bunları da düşünerek bir tekrar cevaplarsanız sevinirim. Bir diğeri siz kendi sürecinizde sürecin toplumsallaşmasını, toplumsal rıza inşalığını nasıl yaptınız? Evet parça parça buna değindik ama biraz daha açarsanız sevinirim. Bir de yani bu mesela inancın örülmesi, insanların sürecin içindeki kendini özne hissetmeleri e, ve nasıl özne yapıldığı ve insanların kendini bunu nasıl hissettiği kısmını sormak istiyorum. Çok karışık oldu. Sabrınız için teşekkürler. Böyle 3 soru diyeyim.
Okay, no, thanks. Yeah. I would say that in our struggle, I mean, those were major issues to confront. And there was a conscious decision to keep mass mobilization going throughout the negotiations process from 1990 until 1994. And of course, and with the labor movement and civil society or other social movements, they also decided that as an integral part of even the democratic era, mass mobilization has to continue. But during the negotiations process, the all forms of mass mobilization took place, both in the workplace, in terms of workplace mobilization, strikes, marches in different parts of the country to support a democratic constitution. And the political movements, the African National Congress and the Communist Party and others and the trade unions, they all participated in that, even while the negotiations were happening. Of course, there was also mobilization from the far right, where they tried to organize a coup d'etats in certain parts of the country, and that was suppressed by different forces in the country. But by and large, until the outcome that was desired was achieved, mass mobilization was not kept back. An armed struggle did cease. There was no longer any armed activity. However, That was also a big debate. And Mandela, for example, did go out to some of the youth because there was infighting within Black communities between different rival political groups. And Mandela did go out and say, please get rid of your arms. The fighting was more with, not with guns so much, well, mainly partly with guns, but also with other types of weapons, to throw your weapons into the sea. But that was to reduce that form of infighting, because what the regime was doing, it was arming and supporting certain groups within the Black community to fight against the political organizations, even during the negotiations process. So they had to try and keep that balance, right? But if I'm remembering correctly, the armed capacity was still kept, although it was a big issue of contestation, was still kept going until they reached a settlement. But the exact point at which arms were given up, or in fact, the agreement was that the armed forces, the guerrilla army, would be integrated into the regular army. So from that point of view, they weren't demobilized. They existed in the camps, in exile, etc., and they came into the country to be integrated into the regular army. So that potential armed capacity was always there, I guess. So if they needed to resume both the armed struggle and the mass struggle against the regime, if they refused to give in to democratic demands, they always had that potential, I suppose, to do that. But it was also a question of trust on both sides with the negotiators, and there was pressure on both sides to get a negotiated settlement. So, yeah. I hope that answers the question.
Şefik
In
Zan
fact,
arkadaşımızın sanırım
can
yorumu ya da
I
sorusu olacak.
can I
Buyur
just
Devin, bir şey mi diyecektin?
can I just add one thing though, because you asked about the question of agency. That's a very important question because it's being debated again now. To what extent do the independent organizations representing different constituencies give up their independence by just emerging with the dominant political party, and also then demobilizing and muting their agency? And some would argue that they did do that too quickly, give up their independence. So, for example, the United Democratic Front, which was an independent umbrella body allied to the African National Congress, but not subordinated to it, they gave up their independence, and the women's organizations became part of the ANC Women's League. The youth organization became part of the ANC Youth League, etc., etc. They became incorporated into the dominant political organizations. So in that sense, agency was diluted. The only mass organization that did not fully give up its independent agency was the trade union movement, which reserved its right to go on strikes, to go mass mobilize, etc., to achieve its demands after 1994. Yeah, so let me stop there.
Şefik Zan, süremizi çoktan aştık ama kısaca eğer sorunu
Evet.
iletirsen cevaplama şansımız
Tabii.
olur.
Hemen soruyu soruyorum. Sesim geliyor değil mi efendim?
Geliyor sesin, buyur.
Öncelikle sunucu arkadaşımız sizlere teşekkür ederim. Soruma geçiyorum. Güney Afrika'da görebildiğimiz kadarıyla oradaki ırkçı faşist yönetime karşı yürütülen mücadele ve barış evresine gelmesinde sınıfsal mücadelenin oldukça belirleyici olduğunu görüyoruz. Çünkü bir komünist örgütlenme var, bir sosyalist örgütlenme var, bir Afrika Sendikalar Birliği örgütlenmesi var öğrenebildiğim kadarıyla. Şimdi buradan hareketle Sayın konuşmacıya şunu sormak isterim. 21. yüzyılda ulusal taleplerle başlayan bir hareketin demokratik bir nitelik olarak ilerleyebilmesi için ülkedeki işçi sınıfının, emekçi sınıfların ve demokratların bir cephe haline getirilmeden sonuç alabilmesi mümkün olur mu? Biz bir hekimiz, mutlaka barışı önemseriz. Bir insanın hayatının kurtarılması bile değerlidir. Şu anda ateşkesin olması, silahların bırakılması insanlık adına sevinçtir, pozitif bir kazançtır. Fakat sorunun bundan sonra çözümlenebilmesi açısından ilgiliye sormak istediğim soru şu, tekrarlıyorum. 21. yüzyılda ulusal taleplerle daralan ve içinde bulunduğu coğrafyada işçi sınıfıyla, emekçi güçlerle ve diğer demokratik yapılarla bir cephe haline gelemezse sonuç alması mümkün müdür? Teşekkür ederim.
A democratic front. I mean, like, so by democratic front, I'm assuming you mean an umbrella body of a whole range of different organizations, which is what we had in South Africa. Political and civic organizations and trade unions, etc. And within that democratic front, the national question and the class question was always debated and in contention. And I think that it broadens the struggle, it gives it widespread legitimacy, and it draws in new constituencies in society. So a broad democratic front is always an important component of a liberation struggle, I think. And not just a one dominant national party. And political parties need to be disciplined in a sense, and need to hear the voices of these other constituencies, because political parties, once they achieve power, the political elites tend to consolidate power, and patronage politics becomes a dominant factor. And will become a dominant factor if there are not these counterbalancing forces within society. And that's a lesson we are always trying to learn in South Africa, how these counterbalancing forces can limit the power of the political elites, who, of course, join the economic elites into a power elite at the top. So a broad front does potentially democratize that movement, broadens and democratizes it. That's why it's a united democratic front. I hope that answers the question.
Ben bir soru sorabilir miyim acaba?
Dilek Yılmaz değil mi? Buyur Dilek. Son
Evet,
soru
evet.
olsun lütfen. Süremiz çoktan açtık. Buyur, söz sende.
Öncelikle merhaba. Sizi görmek çok güzel. Yani sizin deneyimlerinizden faydalanmak da çok güzel. Bu kişisel olarak, yani buradaki bütün arkadaşlar için öyledir. Müthiş feyiz alıyoruz, heyecanlanıyoruz. Belki bu sefer diyebiliyoruz. Geçmiş deneyimleri düşündüğümüz zaman. Ben şunu öğrenmek istiyorum. Sizin mücadeleniz çok zorlu bir süreçti ve bütün dünya bir dönem sizi konuşuyordu. Hatta uzun süre konuşuldu ve biz hala konuşuyoruz. Hani tüm deneyimlerinizi, anekdotlarınızı, anılarınıza kadar inceliyoruz. Sizin bulunduğunuz dönemde, süreçte hem uluslararası alanda, hani çünkü müthiş bir uluslararası kamuoyu yaratılmıştı sizin çeperinizde, öyle hatırlıyoruz. Olgunlaşmış bir sivil toplum, olgunlaşmış bir demokratik toplum. Bunlar oturmuş muydu kendi içinizde? Hani kendi içinizdeki dengelerde bunu nasıl yürüttünüz? Çünkü bizde şöyle bir muhallik var. Evet arkadaşlar, hani sürecin içinde olan arkadaşlar belki daha iyi biliyor. Bir süreç yürütülüyor, hatta bizde sivil toplum ön plana çıkartılmaya falan çalışılıyor. E, Benim kendi adıma hani kendi sürecimizle ilgili olgunlaşmış bir sivil toplum, olgunlaşmış bir demokratik toplum konusunda hala e, kafamızda şeylerimiz var. Soru işaretlerimiz var. Hani bizden yana olan bir durum değil ama hani bu durumun içselleştirilmesi durumunda sizde bu iş nasıl yürüdü? Yani
Okay, so you're talking about the mobilization of civil society inside the country. Yeah. So, yes, if you think about it, it was quite an achievement because the repression in the 1960s was at its worst, right? That's when the organizations were banned. It was these security forces were exceptionally brutal, etc. But then you had this massive strike wave in 1973, and then the student uprisings in 1976. The strike wave was not, interestingly enough, because it's the workplace and you get the pressure from the employers. You can't go and arrest all the workers because then they won't have anyone to do the work for them. So, in a sense, the strike wave was allowed to generate its own momentum. The student uprising was clamped down upon very, very harshly, but then only for it to burst out again, right? And because during the apartheid regime, so that's why the characterization of the apartheid regime as a fascist regime is not entirely correct. Because it was fascistic for the black people, but it had a degree of democracy for white people, right? And with that came a degree of media freedom, right? So there were independent newspapers, for example. So they publicized these struggles for their own reasons, maybe to sell newspapers or because they were liberals and they also wanted the end of apartheid. So that helped to generate a momentum and put pressure on the regime to open up reforms. So what you had in the 1970s was a period when the regime decided, no, we're going to institute reforms. So those were at the very extreme right-wing in the government. They split away. The most right-wing racist components of the regime split away. And so you had P.W. Botha and his reform agenda, which characterized the 1980s. So in an attempt in the 1980s to contain the mass movement, they decided repression alone was insufficient. You need to have reforms. You need to have a degree of consent. So they opened up the terrain of struggle, right? And that allowed civic organizations, civil society to mushroom. Housing organizations, women's organizations, environmental, all sorts of organizations, but civic associations especially in different communities just sprang up throughout the country, right, over the period of 5 years. By 1985, the whole country was a hotbed of organization because the regime was trying to co-opt people into a new system of governance by giving partial rights, but it allowed for mass mobilization to emerge. Then they tried to clamp down on that after 1985. But the labor movement, they couldn't clamp down on for the same reasons that they couldn't clamp down on it in the early 1970s. And because the employers were still saying, no, you can't lock up our workforce. And they were engaging in mass mobilization. So it was just an opportunity, an opening that was exploited to its maximum to generate a crisis in the country. And of course, the external pressure also assisted in that. So yeah. So while there was repression, yes, the momentum made the repression, diluted it to some extent in the 1980s. So that's what I would say as a short answer.
Çok teşekkür ederiz Devan. Süremizi çoktan aştık aslında. Bir 15 dakika aştık. Seni de yorduk sanırım. Kusura bakma. Eğer ekstra bunu söylemem gerekiyor diyen bir arkadaş yoksa toplantıyı bitireceğim. Sanırım yok. Katılan tüm arkadaşlara çok teşekkür ederim. Özellikle Profesör Devan Pillay'e bize zaman ayırdığı, hem değerlendirmelerini hem de deneyimlerini anlattığı için çok teşekkür ediyorum. Çeviri konusunda bize destek olan Bahadır ve Canan arkadaşlar, tekrar teşekkürler. Çok gerçekten bizim için anlamda önemli bir buluşma oldu. Yani barış süreçlerinin her ne kadar her birinin kendi içinde bir öznelliği olsa da benzer deneyimleri bilmek, olası riskleri, çıkmazları konuşmak, bunları aşma konusunda ne yapabileceğimizi tartışmak, düşünmek çok önemli. Bu konudaki tartışmalar tabii bu toplantıyla sınırlı değil. Atasoyer Sağlık Politika Okulu olarak barış ve sağlık buluşmalarımıza devam edeceğiz. Bu toplantının da kaydını yine dediğim gibi Atasoyer Sağlık Politika Okulu'nun internet sayfasında bulabilirsiniz. Bir sonraki toplantıya kadar herkese tekrardan çok teşekkür ediyorum. Görüşmek üzere.